identify as a Middle Eastern North African woman, and of course love working with Duke students and with my colleagues, such as all of you today, on this critically important work that we're doing, this anti-racism work, and we're very, very excited to be here talking with you all today.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Marvis Marcus, and I'm a staff psychologist at Counseling and Psychological Services, or CAPS, and I also serve as the Assistant Director for Training Programs. And it's a pleasure to be back talking with all of you today.
So we're going to go ahead and start with a few definitions. The first one is a definition of insidious trauma. And insidious trauma is a form of trauma associated with characteristics of a person's identity that are devalued by the dominant culture, such as race, gender, sexual orientation, disability. Insidious trauma often begins early in life at a time when one does not have the psychological capacities to understand its sociocultural context, such as when a child is excluded from play because they are not the right color or social class, or because they have a physical disability. Daily exposure over a person's lifetime to such sub-threshold traumatic stressors then lead to the development of particular vulnerabilities, much of which many of you in this room know about, such as health vulnerabilities. And this may be in spite of, or although, one may also develop unique coping strategies and resilience in their lifetimes.
Okay, and I'll give you another definition, which is referred to as racial incidents. Can be defined as cognitive or affective assaults on one's ethnic self-identification. These assaults can be verbal attacks, physical attacks, or threats to livelihood. Because they are racially motivated, they strike the core of one's selfhood. The assaults can be sudden or systematic, intentional or unintentional, or overt or ambiguous, and can be perpetuated by an individual, so that in the form of interpersonal racism, or institutional or systematic or systemic racism, or cultural hegemony or cultural racism. Okay, so we wanted to provide you to, or provide everyone here with those definitions, just to provide a context for our conversation today.
And I guess, I'm sorry, I am a clinical social worker, so we're always on the front line for social justice. So we want to take this opportunity, because it's more about you today. We have a slew of questions. We've seen the emails. We've seen a lot of things. So we want to open it up for your discussion, and we are going to transition out at 10 of 1:50. So we want to make sure we open the floor up for, and please ask your questions, because that will allow us to help unpack it, develop it, or offer some suggestions and other resources here that you can also use to help continue the discussion beyond our discussion today. So who wants to start with the first question, burning question? We're ready, so bring it on.
Yeah.
I would start with, considering the recent events in Charlottesville, as well as the events on campus here with the removal of a statue. I would just ask for your perspectives on the impact that you believe that having statues that honor, the memory, or that revere key figures that were part of, the Civil War, such as Robert E. Lee. What impact do you feel, or what's your perspective on the impact that having those statues on campus has on people of color?
Well, I'll start by saying I think working with the 16 plus thousand students that we are responsible for, and we see about 13% of those students going through our agency. Students of color, if we just doing broad stroke, because everyone is not monolithic. People don't think, they think differently. It's, how anti-black, what is your internalized racism? There's a whole lot of stuff to unpack, but I would say the majority of students do not feel welcome. And they feel it's oppressive for them. It has a history of oppression, bigotry, hatred, violence, a lot of violence. So those are the themes so they represent a very different, especially for, I would say, blacks that are in American-born blacks or marginalized students more so. But I think all students, when they know the history, or most.
I think it's highly problematic. So I want to state that that's my perspective and viewpoint immediately. And I want to say that it's complicated. And I think that part of what my role is in my working directly with students and clients and other colleagues is to complicate as much as possible. Because I think that we can, like our president made a decision to remove the statue, and then we can kind of get swept away with that and thinking that there's a certain intentionality behind that. But I think it's a lot of politics on campus. There's a lot of reasons for why those decisions were made, some good, some more tied to the fiscal ramifications of things. And so I think that it's important for us to think critically. I mean, like I did my own research on the planting of statues, and that was actually happening during the civil rights movement. What happened was when the statue fell in Durham, when we had activists take it down, there was a lot of criticism about, well, how was it that it came down so easily, right? You're thinking of a statue, it's really, really heavy. But during civil rights, a lot of white nationalist, KKK groups actually casted a lot of statues across the nation, and they did it with very cheap quality materials, and that was also a political movement, right? To crush the revised history of what has happened in the United States. So the dominant cultural group had put in a lot of work to get statues cheaply made and implanted across the United States in important locations such as universities. But we have a counter-narrative on campus, and it's a counter-narrative that's really, really important. And what I say to friends, students, colleagues is look into as much of what's said as what's unsaid. What's unsaid is just as important as what is said. We have Abele. Do we know who Mr. Abele is here? The African-American man who is credited, actually not credited as publicly as necessary for the construction of the architecting of everything on campus. This man was an African-American human being and wasn't even allowed to step foot in Duke Chapel, which they drew up the blueprints for. So again, what's said and what's unsaid. We are students, I should say, had a strong movement on campus to have a dedicated space for Abele. And what we got was a plaque this big, maybe, in the quad. So the quad was dedicated to him, and what was asked for was that the West Union, what is now the Richard Brodhead Center or something. I still call it the West Union, was dedicated to Richard Brodhead, who was our previous president. And students asked for that to be named for Abele. So thinking about these things and thinking about how we can complicate the discourse as much as possible within ourselves and with other individuals on campus, I think it's necessary. It's critical for us to do. Because I think what can happen as a person of color is that we see these things happen and then we're happy. We're like, okay, this is fulfilling. But that's not really the beginning or the end of the issue, right? Because the critical thing for us to do would be to do a broad sweep of all of these racist icons and symbols across the nation and proactively remove them or revise our history appropriately, which isn't what happened. It was a reactive move. It was a reactive decision. So it's complicated. Dr. Marcus? Okay.
And from what I understand, there are ceilings and there are microphones in the ceilings, so I think we should be able to hear you.
Well, was this the first time this fall that it was questioned about that statue coming down in front of the chapel?
It was not. It is my understanding that there have been a slew of divinity students, majority of whom have been people of color who have requested for that statue to be removed in what they would describe as what most people describe as a sacred space, a place of refuge, and that fell on deaf ears.
Students were told that one of the ways that there was pushback with the development of the statue was that his uniform was a northern uniform, and that was the way that they slighted him. But I think there's, again, a lot that's unsaid in that, right? This figurehead of racism and a racist movement in the United States. The way that we're going to slowly or underhandedly slight him is by putting the wrong uniform on them, whereas with Abele, there's nothing historically noted or recorded in a way that I think needs to be recorded for our narrative and our history here at Duke University.
Any more questions about the statute in the chapel? Anything?
Why that particular statue was put in there in the first place? I mean, I understand the comment about the public places, Duke is a private school, et cetera, et cetera. And
Well, my understanding and the limited knowledge that I have, because I'm not sitting on those boards and having in that decision-making process, is that it's a mystery. They're still not sure who, how, and I find it very interesting that at a top-tier, world-renowned university that we can keep archives and records going back thousands of years and preserve them, that we cannot find the information about who, what, and how the decision was made to even place him there in the first place.
While y'all are thinking about questions, something that we got a lot of in the questions and comments was how to work through when racist acts and violence occur in public domains, how to handle that in the workplace. I guess before we go into kind of answering what our suggestions would be, I'm curious to know what you all have seen, what you all have experienced, what you've done yourselves. Let's say, for example, following what happened in Virginia. How do you have those conversations?
Well, from what I've seen or observed, the conversation typically happens or comes up when someone says, well, can you believe, what happened, or did you see, such and such on the news? And it's more so a conversation around the disbelief that it happened, but not really a conversation around why is it happening, or, why are things like this happening or still happening. And so I guess my question is, how do you approach something that can be a really polarizing or, kind of charged conversation at work when you don't want to offend your coworkers, you don't want to put someone on the defense, especially, when you're having kind of a mixed company, you want to be able to have an honest conversation, but at the same time want to be respectful of your colleagues.
I was going to say, but I want to actually make sure this is equitable, please.
Well, first, let me say that I think I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that there are really evocative conversations to have, especially in a workplace. It's no secret that one of America's greatest sins has been race and racism, and that's something that we're constantly battling with. And what a lot of people are describing as historical forms of racism, I would probably just say that it's present-day forms of racism. At no point in our history has racism not marred America's history. And so I think that, there are conversations that should be had at work if we are to really get to know each other, if we are to foster community with each other. And so I kind of offer, many people that I work with will kind of commonly hear me say that I am a Black psychologist, first and foremost, and I do psychology as a Black psychologist. And I language it that way very intentionally because psychology has a history, and even in some ways still is, a vehicle of oppression, racial oppression in particular. And so I'm very clear and emboldened in how I describe myself as a Black psychologist, right? And so I enjoy those conversations. I think that they can be challenging, but for me to be silent about my experience as a Black person in America would be crazy making. It would be, and I hesitate to use the word crazy because I know it's very loaded, but I don't see how I would have a good life chance if I were not able to speak to my subjective reality as a Black person who is a steward of psychology, right? I'll also say that when I arrive at work at the counseling center, I don't stop being Black, right? People still very much experience me as a black man, perhaps before they experience me as anything. And so I think that it would be remiss of me to pretend as though I don't need to have those conversations, or that my colleagues are not curious about my ethnocultural background, because I'm very much curious about theirs. So in psychology, there's a term by the name of cultural mistrust, which is a fancy way of saying that there are a lot of people of color in the world who are very suspicious of the medical field, are very suspicious of psychological services, are very suspicious of public welfare programs, and for many reasonable reasons. And so I say that to say this. I think that conversations should be had. I think that there's a way to have a timely conversation, and conversations can be difficult, and they can also foster community.
And I would say, you know, it's about, and I mean, as being a social worker working with marginalized communities, that's just kind of what we do. We would probably be remiss if we didn't talk about the white race and how the white race has contributed to where we are today in America, you know, and we have to own it. I don't know if it's internal, is it shame, guilt, I don't know what it is, but you know, you can't talk about black, the race, or slavery, or whatever. We also have to talk about the contributions of the white race. And that's where I am. That's what I want to talk about.
Can I maybe say one more thing? And I really love what Mozella just said, because I think a part of critical discourse around about race and racism includes racing white people. White, in fact, is a race. And I think that oftentimes in conversations, white people become the invisible norm, or the metric through which other people are measured, often stringently. And so it's very important for us to have racial conversations that include racing white people, because white people are a racial class. And I think the cultural hegemony around that has privileged them in that they become the invisible norm, right? And I think that there's a critical way to have that conversation about white people, because I don't have I suspect that people, when they see me, they automatically categorize me as black, understandably so, right? And I don't have much option in being raced that way. I think one of the privileges that the white majority have is that sometimes they can opt into racial conversations, and other times they don't have to opt into racial conversations. But I am indefinitely raced as a black man.
And as a continuation to that, we actually brought a handout for you all that allows you to practice what it is that we're talking about in this moment. I think that I taught multicultural psychology for a very long time, and racism was always the charged topic, where, you know, there was like a classroom of students who are sitting with each other. All of a sudden there's a divide. There's like the white students who are defensive over here, and the students of color who are on the offense over here, and the people in the center who are a mixture, and they're like, I don't want anything to do with this conversation. And in order to try to make that conversation as inclusive as possible, I think that it's problematic when we don't explore our own heritage and ethnicities of origin, right? When someone says, oh, well, I'm just American, and in quotes that's, or in parentheses that's, I'm just white, because I'm not sure what that means, and there's a lot of missed opportunities for connection when we don't know about our narratives or our heritage of origin, the stories about our families coming here. Cornel West said that black people didn't know that they were black until an Irish person saw a black person and said, oh, that's what you mean. And what's implied there is that there are narratives of discrimination and racism and prejudice that also occurred in the hierarchy of races that immigrated here to the United States. Immigrated and were forced over here to the United States. I want to come back, though, to your question and say that this idea that we have to have a non-offensive conversation, I also think that we have to commit to a different entry point into these difficult conversations. People are going to be offended. In fact, as a brown woman in the United States, I'm offended all the time, every day that I walk into work, based on the dominant discourse and business as usual, which is dominant culture or white business as usual. So I think that if we're going to do race equity work, we have to commit to, we're going to offend each other, and we're committed to coming back to the table, to continue talking about these things, to continue trying to gain understanding. Because as long as we're doing this respectability politic, I think we're only going to get so far, and it's only going to be so surface level. So there has to be a commitment to it being uncomfortable, a commitment to the things that will inevitably happen in these conversations in order for us to actually get further.
Yes, and to further this, and to the original person that asked the question, I think it would be fine to say, to talk about what you at least introduced there. You know, how did we get here? I personally find it hard to believe that we are where we are today myself. So, you know, as a white person, as a white race member, yeah, how did we get here, and what can we do to change it? Because I figure we're all in the room here because we don't like where it is, you know? Do you have an answer on how to change it?
Suggestions or recommendations?
Well, and you know, as a white woman, I have tried to learn as much as I possibly can, because I feel like I probably walk around and do stupid, offending things without even thinking about it, because of what you said, the invisible norm, not even meaning to. And I have some very good friends that have just spilled how they get just racial attacks on a daily basis, and I listen to this and I get so angry. Their daughter, or their, you know, 'cause she's a mixed race child, and just the way she stopped being invited to birthday parties now, and she's 12, and you know, and it's devastating to me to hear these things, but I don't know how to fix it. And it's not, I know it's not my job only to fix it, it's our job to fix it, but it's like, how do you start? Should I just have a birthday party, invite only? You know, it's just like, how do we make this, that we're in this together, you know, instead of, I don't know, it's just frustrating, and it's, I want to make a difference instead of just sit back but, you know, at the same time, it's not woe's me. So it's hard to figure out where to fit.
No, still building off the same topic. I know, especially with the recent events, it's the conversations I've had with old grade school friends, and the questions come up similar to what she just said. She wants to kind of figure out how is the best way to kind of jump in. And my response to a friend of mine who was white, who was saying, oh, well, you know, it's hard to know how to phrase things because as a white person, the racism hasn't been directed at me, so I don't really know how to respond. And I gave an analogy. I was like, if you're at a pool, at a public pool, and someone's in the pool, you see they're struggling, they're drowning, are you going to stand on the side of the pool and ask them, what can I do to help you? How can you tell me how to help you? Or are you going to do whatever, like go with your gut? And the response I got back was, well, what if the person standing on the side of the pool can't swim? And I'm like, well, the person that's in the pool that's drowning can't swim either. So it's like, we have to all understand that at the root of it, we're all people, whether we're black, white, whatever ethnic origin, we're people. And so if you see a person that's struggling, that's your struggle too. You don't get a pass because you're not in that same group. And nothing's gonna change until people understand that we don't have the option of opting out, because we're all people, and racism, just because it seems to be causing the most pain to a certain group of people, everybody else isn't immune from it. Racism does affect you, whether it's happening directly to you, skin to skin or not. Racism affects you. So it's still like, there's no easy answer. We don't have a handbook just because we're black. So we can't really offer anyone a clear answer or a set of guidelines as to how to help, because we're trying to figure it out every day, just like everybody else. Like you said at the beginning when you introduced yourself, I wake up in the morning, I'm a black person, I'm a black woman, I face the world, and I get by the best way that I can. And that's what everybody else in the room is doing too. You wake up in the morning, you come to work, and you don't know exactly how your day is gonna go, but you figure it out and you work with people to try to, you know, get done what you need to get done, and that's really what it's all about.
I certainly empathize with those who say that they don't really know what to do or how to do it. They want to do the right thing, which I really admire. And I also will maybe foreground this idea that I think one of the primary tenets of white supremacy is perfectionism and efficiency, and wanting to know exactly how to do something, when to do something, and wanting a particular outcome. And I think that that's a very intellectually driven way of going about learning how to be a social justice advocate. And part of the problem with that is that I can learn about something intellectually, but I also know experientially what it means to be a black person. And so I would just maybe caution my white colleagues in the room to trouble this idea that you need to know exactly what to do and how to do it, is because that can be interrogated as an axiom of white supremacy, perfectionism.
I think the thing that's terrifying for me in light of what's gone on, I don't know, like since I felt like I wanted to throw up in November, is that, you know, I think we're seeing now like what an enormous percentage of white people in this country are just flat out abject racists who have been waiting to have the lid let off of it, and now it is, right? And some of those people work here, right? And so the conversations here are incredibly volatile. Because the one thing that group of people is really good at, as we've been seeing from Richard Spencer and the people who got their educations here at Duke, some of them, is that they're very good at using the tools of things like HR regulations to turn a conversation about calling them to accountability for abject racism into discrimination or hostile workplace, right? So, you know, I think there's so much, at least among the people that I talk with, you know, this trauma thing that's like right up here across the races of people that I know. I mean, you know, and it's here, and it's very, I mean, even just standing in the kitchen at the coffee machine talking about it, you know, I'm cautious, right? And it's a very difficult thing when that becomes so wedded to the parts of our discourse that we usually would resort to or appeal to try and carve out a space to talk about it. And it frustrates me in some ways to, I mean, the expectation that we be like nice and concerned to each other in but you know, like if I went there in those conversations, and I know this is nothing new to any of the people of color in this room, but like I would be like, I cannot work with you at all, get out of my face. You know, and we would, and then I would be fired, right? Because they would keep their job. And it feels like that's where it is everywhere, right? Like the person behind you in the grocery store, the guy with road rage behind you in the car, right? It's just so loaded. And so in some ways, even these conversations about perfection, it's not even, you know, it's not even perfection, it's just, in some ways it's easier to figure out how to have somebody's back because people are making themselves more visible, right? But still, it feels fundamentally different than even a year ago. I mean, I think that, you know, something is incredibly different in this country and in a terrifying, terrifying way.
Yeah, people are emboldened.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to maybe possibly answer or attempt to answer the question of, you know, what can I do? And, you know, I totally agree with the statement that we're all people, we're all trying to figure it out, and there may not be some big book sitting somewhere that says what exactly to do. But interestingly enough, because I'm a dork, I watch C-SPAN. And if you ever want to know anything about anything under the sun and know about it in detail, C-SPAN seems like a great place to start. And Book TV, C-SPAN 2, are really, really great places. And they actually do have panels that do nothing for 3 whole hours, but talk about whatever so, you know, there are handbooks. If you can pick a topic, because there's so many different areas where this could go downhill. Racism is in everything, right? It's in housing, it's in research, it's in our, you know, it's in employment. So you pick a topic and run with that. But for example, a lot of people, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what Black Lives Matter is and what it does. There's really not an excuse for not understanding Black Lives Matter because they have a website where they have a manifesto that tells you what they're doing, why they're doing it, what their mission is, who formed the group, what their goals are. They're not just a group that's out there yelling and screaming, but they actually have goals. They actually do go and talk to legislators and lawmakers because their goal is to reform the prison system and to reform how we criminalize, you know, how we perceive people and how we criminalize people. And it just so happens that, you know, African American and Latino people, the way that we are criminalized and the way that we're perceived and how the system is set up is that we're kind of at a disadvantage before we're even in kindergarten. And those are things that are broken down and explained very, very clearly through their website. And also on, like I said, C-SPAN, you know, you can do a search and they have video after video after video and it's hours and hours long. And they tell you what you can do. Specifically, you know, looking at how you vote, paying attention to your local your local and state, you know, elections and stuff like that. I mean, that stuff affects, you know, if you're voting for someone whose politics and views and competencies are not in line with doing things that are going to be beneficial to the entire community, then maybe you didn't mean to, but you just participated in perpetuating the things that are damaging to this other group. So that's like just one of the more obvious, smaller things. You know, looking at, you know, if you're a business owner, looking at your business practices, looking at how you set your business up in an area you may not mean to. But one of the things me and my friends get into a rant about all the time is, you know, we love Durham, Durham is great, but there are parts of Durham that are, for all intents and purposes, being gentrified. We love to see the fact that Durham is growing and progressing and building and advancing. We love to see that. But what we don't like to see is that the people that have been there for 50 years, 80 years, disappear. And they don't have an opportunity to participate in that growth and those benefits. That's something you can do. You can show up to your town hall meetings and things like that. And so I think a lot of times when we think about what can we do, we look at it from a reactive place, showing up to protests, you know, taking down statues, which I think is great, but, you know, taking down the statue is wonderful up until we still have laws and things in place that are not helpful. And the attitudes haven't changed. So those are things, if you're looking for what can I do, something as minor as doing your research on whatever group it is. If you don't understand what's happening in the Middle East and why all that stuff's happening, you know, it's right here, you know. Get a deeper understanding, like she was, you know, like Nahal was saying, getting a deeper understanding of that stuff. Start there. I also, quick PSA, and then I'm done. I am always down for having these conversations, you know, answering questions, coming from my experience the best that I can and what I've learned and classes I've taken and things that I've done. But I do not like having people come to me with questions and and they haven't done any research first. You know, it's kind of like if I walk up to someone Caucasian, I'm just like, well, tell me about white people. Well, I don't, what do you want to know? So if you come with something very specific, I'm more helpful, but I can't do anything with kind of a top level thing.
I love the way that you laid that out. because my mind works very ecologically, and I think that when I say that, I mean there's different levels that we can impact, and we can do things at the immediate individual level, we can do things on our own. And I think I appreciate that PSA because not everybody feels that way. Not everybody wants to be approached, and I want to make, and for those of us who are open to that, I mean, a lot of grace and gratitude for you. And so I say that because it's not a requirement. I'm not a spokesperson for the Middle East or North Africa, and I think that conflation or that assumption can be made in workspaces. And I think another piece that I want to add to that is that there's a difference between an indictment and a question that's really from a curious place. And I'll give you an example of that. You know, President Ahmadinejad came to the United States and said, I'm sorry if this is new history for you, it's really embarrassing, but he said gay people aren't in Iran. And you know, people walked up to me then and said, did you hear about what Ahmadinejad said? That's not really like a curious question about like what LGBTQ rights are in Iran, what the culture is there. That's like, this guy is an ass, and you know, this is an indictment. It's not like a respectful conversation. So I think understanding what the difference is between those two, and sometimes I think that we go immediately to an indictment because we don't actually know how to access these conversations. And so maybe just pausing and thinking about that and thinking about what the question is before approaching other human beings. We notice this a lot in our own space. I mean, we are surrounded by mental health professionals. Our job on a daily basis is to talk to human beings about things that are so painful that they can't talk about them to other people. And we were doing our dismantling racism work, we would have colleagues say, I just don't know what to say. And what I would say to them is, how is it that we don't share every single experience with our clients? I have clients who come in, they tell me that they have been traumatized in ways that, every which way, horrific ways. And it would be highly problematic if I, as a psychologist sitting across from this human being, were to sit and look at them and say, I don't know what to say to you. So when my colleagues say to me, I don't know what to say, I invite them to think about that alternative scenario. So when that client comes in and they say those things to you that haven't been your lived experiences, what is it that you say to them? And thinking about that when these events happen, right? Some colleagues are comfortable with being approached. You know, something that Marvis had said in our agency, following which of the many events was it? Which event was it?
The shootings.
Yeah, following the shootings last summer. Not a single soul approached him. And he's one of my closest friends. I was recarpeting my house, and for a split second, I was like, I wanted to ask him to go check up on the people recarpeting my house, and I was like, nope, you as a black man, I have no idea who those people are who are going to be at my house, because every moment, every second that I have Marvis is a blessing, because he could, and this is no over-exaggeration at all, he could die at any moment, any single day as a black man, because he's not a psychologist the minute that he steps out of his apartment. And so I think about these things, right? Anything you want to add about?
I just want to say the same. When my husband leaves, I call to make sure he got to work, he's coming back. My nephews, it's an assault on whether you want to be anti-black, it's internalized racism. It's too much for me to take, I'm too overwhelmed. But I deal in reality, and me and my family and the people that I love and care so much about in this world and in the United States, it's not just in the United States, around the world too, the planet, but in the United States are under constant assault every day. And I am too. And so I'm having to work as a clinical person, take care of myself, take care of hundreds of other people, and still show up ready to even have this discussion with you, which is a little bit harder for me because I'm also dealing with my wounds as well, right? So it opens up things for me. This work is hard, and if we all sit around, and really, to be honest with you, this work is between white people. It really is. It has nothing to do with us. We are doing our work. We've been doing our work since, 1865, even before then. We don't get a chance to not do the work. And this work now is for white people in this country. Because if you don't think it's about you, just wait and see. And we know if you have done the deep critical analysis from healthcare disparities to educational disparities to pay disparities right here. All this stuff is happening at Duke University, right? All of it. And we know it, whether we speak of it or not. And when you don't speak, you have to be strategic to speak about these pains and wounds, because it's impacting all of us. But most importantly, it's embracing and supporting white supremacy, because it is about divide and conquer. The strategy is to divide. The strategy is there's a hierarchy. The strategy is secrecy. The strategy is all of that. So it's scarcity and it's an abundance. When you have people making $40 billion to here, or 30 million, or whatever they're making, 30 million. And if we talk corporate, we know they can make a lot more, right? You know, you have startups making, 20 billion. So, and it's on the backs of people that really buy into capitalism and buy into what they just aren't critically thinking. Because we also know that if we talk about all the abundance that we do have, because there's certain people that know that there's an abundance, right? They know that I can get disability, I can get food stamps, and it's the majority of people. Poor people or people with scarcity of resources, they're coming into your research trials. Diabetes, lost limbs, poor, dying early, obesity, all sorts of things. Whatever you all are doing, and I'm very familiar and know people who work here and in management. So let's ask the hard and difficult questions, because this soft stuff, it's over. And people are alert and they know. So if you're in management and you think they don't know me, they don't get me, they do. So I ask you to, my appeal is that you hold your leadership accountable and responsible. It's not for mid-manager and admins and supervisors to fight this. This is the people you pay the money that's well-trained, graduated from Duke, Harvard, wherever, Northwestern, wherever your elite staff and management is coming from. It's their responsibility to deal with this, not us running around and then being afraid, and you going home with high blood pressure, and am I going to get fired? And it's an intimidation to white allies. White people are scared. They're like, I know my person is, my black friend or Latinx friend or whomever, gay friend is struggling and having a very difficult time on many levels. But if I do anything, then I'm going to be targeted as well. So that's when management needs to come in. I'm just going to, I'm just speaking the truth.
I agree with you, but the problem is that you don't have a lot of management that come to these meetings, and they don't seem to be open and trying to get their groups to work together as far as diversity is concerned, So I don't even know how that problem can be addressed, because there's a lot of times that I want to say something, but I feel the same way. Well, if I really say what I feel or what I think, then I might be on my way out the door.
I remember when we led a revolt in our graduate program, Dr. Marcus and I, we would have these late night meetings every week, and we would always say to each other and to the group, we need some white people here. And though that sounds cheeky, it's true, because for whatever reason, to 5 POC voices, 1 white voice, it's equal to 1 white voice or something. I'm not sure what the formula is, the powers that be hold that. But I think that there's a formula. I think that it's really hard to be out there alone, and I think that it's important for us to come together as much as possible. What Dr. Fuller was saying a moment ago about white people needing to do the work together, that's supported by research that says that for whatever reason, white people, and we could come up with some, possibilities and the reasons white people are more put off by hearing non-white people talk about race. And it's more effective if they hear it from themselves. We have a psychologist in the counseling center by the name of Michael Etzi. You can find his bio if you Google Duke Counseling Center, and he does a workshop called Witnessing Whiteness for students. Check him out. Send him an email and ask him. Maybe gather as a white caucus and try to do this this curriculum that I'm sure he will be willing to send to you collectively. And then people of color, our work is different, I would say. I think, Zora Neale Hurston said, all skin folk ain't kin folk. And more than ever, we need to come together, because as long as we are fighting for scraps, the dominant culture is remaining in power. And one person of color voice that's for the system is also louder than a sea of people of color who are in pain and being oppressed. So also interrogating and not trying to perpetuate oppression Olympics or a hierarchy of oppression. You know, you've said this so many times, nobody's racing to the bottom. So we need to come together and we need to talk about how we can support each other as people of color, and not doing so, how it's perpetuating the hierarchy that exists right now. Yeah?
Ooh, this is wonderful. Thank you so much. I love it, engaging this way. It's really, it's invigorating, it's inspiring. It sort of supports the work that I believe in and do every day and wake up ready to do. Because I believe that we all are family and that we can really do this together if we step out of our comfort zones, don't feel the fear. Don't be afraid. You know, have a community. Don't do it by yourself. It's too much. And I will take one last thank you all, and I'll let everyone say, but one last burning question if you have to, because we have about 3 minutes. Oh, we'll take two. We'll take two.
I'm just curious to know if you remember UNC had a little bit of a mishap because the students were trying to take another statue down from their campus.
Could you repeat that?
What do you tell your students? And I'm curious because I have a child that goes to UNC. What do you tell? How do you teach your students, or how do you teach young people, kids, how to get involved in, you know, for me it's like I want my kid to be involved, but I'm scared to death that she goes to one of these events because she's, you know, we're Latino. Like, what do you say?
So I certainly work with students. It's no secret Duke University is the campus body is very politically active.
Can you repeat our question, please?
Repeat the question?
Yeah.
The question was how might we support students who are on campus and who may possibly want to be politically active, or how can they take care of themselves?
From different
racial groups.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Student activism.
Student activism, basically. So I work with, Duke University, the campus body is it's pretty politically active, especially with a lot of the fraud that's happening in the world now. But I really focus on having kind of like a twofold conversation with students. And so if they are deciding to be politically active, I think that that's very great and admirable, but I also I support them in doing that and figuring out ways that they can push back with regard to the system. I think developmentally it makes sense. It helps with identity development in terms of a person figuring out who they want to be, how they want to show up in the world. And I'm also very intentional in having a conversation with students on how they're going to engage in self-care. Because I think that political activism is a form of labor, especially for people of color. Right, so I try to have the both sides of that conversation. I think sometimes they can become polarized. So I think having both sides of that conversation is really important. If you're going to be engaged, that's great. Let's figure out how you can be safe and how you can, do what you need to do, and how you're going to take care of yourself.
Yeah, and I think, being intentional about the reality of your phenotype or the reality of your presentation. I mean, there was that KKK rally downtown, and I happen to be out of town, but a lot of my white colleagues were texting me, they're like, we're gonna go to this KKK rally. And when I hear that, my alarm signals are off. I'm like, I don't know, I'm like imagining people in like capes and tall hats and like pitchforks and stuff. So I'm like, I need to do a little bit of research on that, and I tell my students the same thing, because certain bodies will be killed and sacrificed. And so that isn't me saying, other bodies need to be sacrificed in place of these bodies, but it's let's have really intentional discussions about what activism means, how you can engage activism, the ecological different forms of it, how do you do it within yourself. A form of resistance is self-care, because as people of color, oftentimes we are told that we're never going to be good enough. So we constantly need to keep pushing and working all hours of the day. So one form of activism and resistance is being good to yourself, right? Being connected to yourself. So having those discussions as well, I would say.
And the truth of the matter is, kind of going back to your question, is that protest isn't for everybody.
Yeah.
Right, and so that's only one way that you can be subversive, and it's not for everybody. I don't know the last time that I've admittedly attended a protest. I know that for me, my form of activism is in the counseling center when I sit with Black and brown people who feel like they don't matter at Duke University. That's my activism. I stand with those people and helping them make their way to eventually get to their degrees.
You can write letters, she can write the president of universities, president of all students. So there's many ways. I mean, there's a class. I mean, when I was in grad school, we had classes on how to protest, right? Are you going to write an op-ed? Are you going to go right to the president? You have access. So yeah, I think as people of color, we don't know what our rights are. First of all, we don't even know what we can do because we've been told what we can't do. And we can do a lot more than we believe we can do because we don't know. So, it's many ways.
I just wanted to add, I'm not sure which one of you mentioned earlier that about racism in the United States, and it's not just here. In my job, I get to travel quite a bit, and I have been to Brazil, and couldn't wait to get there and wanted to see the sights. And the driver that was taking us to the hotel said, it's best you not go travel because people will look at you and may attack you just because of your color. Okay. And okay, I spent that majority of that trip in the hotel. I was in Canada a few months ago, and the cab driver basically didn't think I could pay him the fare, and I got out of the cab. When I approached the cab station and asked for another taxi, he said, what happened to the one I just gave you? I said the driver told me he couldn't take me anywhere because I was crazy. And he immediately, long story short, they got me another cab. The cab driver was fired. I didn't go there to get the cab driver fired. I went to get a cab to my hotel. But I can go on and on about instances in my role, in my position now at Duke, where I arrive at the airport, I pick up a rental car. Because I've been doing this so long, hey, I get a really nice rental car. I've had a BMW SUV. I didn't even know they made one. Okay, and I'm out and I go to the sites, but you wouldn't be surprised what I get faced with on a daily basis. And when I go travel, I put on a protective cape around me. I heighten my senses because I don't know what's going to come at me. So it's not just in the United States. Not that it's all over.
And I'm glad you bring that up because something that we will hear often in racial discourses is why just black, white? Why should we talk about just black, white? We talk about this all the time. Typically, not typically, always, I'm gonna be bold and say, it's not bold, I think it's true, it's factually true to say that the metric or the hierarchy of oppression, people of color, we wanna be anything but black. And there's a reason for that. And we need to interrogate that and understand why that is. People of color will also say, they'll say, okay, well, at least we're not black. And there's a historical reasoning and rationale for that. And that's why understanding history is so important. Because there are international perspectives on this. And it's based on skin color, absolutely. And that's why I think we need to have these discussions. And that's why the important, necessary point of departure in race talks is absolutely history and the black-white schism. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
I didn't buy